You know, I was just thinking about visual data containers. Let me show you what I mean. The first visual data container I'd like to talk about is ListBox. And let's take a look at grocery list WPF and run this code. And we see something here that looks very much like the ListBox from WinForms. In fact, this application is intended to mimic it to some extent. So we can add to the list, we can type things in, and remove from the list, and remove a selected item, or remove a specific location. So in these ways, it's very much the same as the ListBox from WinForms. However, let's take a look at the actual code. And we'll start with the designer and go to the properties pane. And if we open up common, we can see that it has an items collection. And here we can add items to the list box like you might expect. I think the easiest way to see the difference is to look at the XAML code. So here's your list box, and in order to put things in the list box, basically all you have to do is put between the start list box tag and the end list box tag anything you want to have in there. Okay, so in this case we have strings, and they were added using the property dialog. But we're not limited to that. For example, we can put in controls. So even though these are what I'm calling visual data containers, they're not limited to just data. We can even put in visual control containers themselves, and they themselves can have additional controls. And of course, since you can put this sort of stuff into a list box, you can put images into a list box. So, list boxes in WPF do everything that list boxes in WinForms do, and a whole lot more in a very easy way. And this is largely due to the behavior of all WPF controls that allow you to nest just about any kind of control or resource inside just about any other control or resource. So now let's move on and talk about data binding with visual data containers. And we'll start by looking at observable grocery list. So if we run the code, visually this is just a pared down version of the last example. We can add things and we can remove things by selecting them. So this is just a view list like we saw before, but the code underneath has something really interesting. Let's look at the code, and I want to start by saying that this does do data binding, and we see we have a class here called grocery list view model. This example doesn't actually have a model class, it just has a view model because it's so simple. But you could easily add a model class and do exactly the same thing, because the important part of this example is the data binding itself. And before we look at the grocery list view model class, let's take a look at the code behind for the page. So the first thing we see is our field, which is a reference to our list view model. And as we look at the code, again, because we're using data binding, I want you to notice that we don't access the list view object itself directly. We only update the view model. In this case, it's grocery source, and so we're adding something to the grocery source using the groceries data structure. And when we want to remove something, conversely, we use remove. So the list view is not accessed directly at all from within the code behind. And the only time we access the view model is with add and remove, as you see here. All the rest of the code in the code behind has to do with maintaining the view, the WPF application. So now in the constructor, I want you to notice that I've set the item source property of my list box to my list view model object. And in particular, what I want you to notice is that I have not done this. I have not set the data context. So previously, whenever we did data binding, we set the data context of the window so that we could get access to the list view model or the model objects. So there's no reference to data context here. How do I pull off this piece of magic? Well, introducing the observable collection. This is really cool in terms of data binding, because you'll note that all that code that we needed before to do data binding is missing from this example. In other words, we're not implementing iNotify property changed. We don't have to add that special code. We never assign anything to data context. And there's not even anything in the XAML file that refers to this data structure. So all I have to do is create in my view model or in my model an observable collection. And as you see, it's a generic, so I can have an observable collection of anything. And then in my code behind, I assign an instance of the object with the observable collection in it to item source. And later we'll see that not only does ListBox have an item source property. So does list view, which is the next kind of visual data collection control that we're going to look at. So that's it. It's almost too easy. All you have to do is put an observable collection object in your model or your view model or your controller, and then assign that to item source of your visual data collection object. And also note that if we go back to the view model, here I said string to keep things simple, but because this is a generic, I could put something more general in there, like let's say object, and then make a couple of modifications in my code behind. And now I have the ability to load images or any other sorts of things into my list box that I might like. And we can see that here. And now I have an image in my list box. Now you should note that remove will no longer work on that. It'll still work on the text, but it won't work on the images. So you'd have to add some additional code to remove things based on selection rather than text. But the point is, you can now do data binding by just creating an observable collection and assigning to item source of your visual data container, whether that's a list box or a list view, a reference to that observable collection. And also note that you can mix the two kinds of data binding. So in other words, you could have an application that has observable collections and does data binding the way we've seen earlier, implementing iNotify property and the related code. Let's take a look at kitchen logistics. So this example has three classes, cookware, dry goods, and garden, that function as our model classes, and kitchen, which is our intermediate class, and then of course those are connected to our WPF application. So let's start by looking at cookware. And you see this is a very simple class, just has a list of equipment, and in the constructor I'm going to go ahead and add some default equipment if you like. You'll notice that there's no evidence here of any kind of data binding code. It's just data. The class dry goods just has two properties, ingredient and amount, and those, as you can see, are auto-implemented. And garden is our model class that does have an observable collection. In other words, it does have some evidence that data binding is likely going to be done here at some point. And once again, we are preloading in the constructor for garden our list with 3 items. And then everything comes together in kitchen. It's got an auto-implemented property for garden, an auto-implemented property for cookware, and an observable collection, observable dry goods. So now we have 2 different observable collection data structures, one in a model class and one in an intermediate class. And in the constructor for kitchen, we predefine some data to go in the observable dry goods observable collection data structure. And just to show that this is also an opportunity to modify the other data structures, we are going to add a couple of items to the vegetable garden, and then finally add one to the equipment list. All right, so that's our model. Let's take a look at what this looks like in the view. So we go to the code behind for this application, and we see that once again we have a field that instantiates the intermediate class, and we have 3 visual data controls. We have a list view, we have a list box, and then we have something that's even simpler than list view or list box. We have something known as an items control. And for each of these, we are assigning something to item source. Notice again that we do not have an assignment to the data source property of kitchen or any other object for that matter. So we're doing all of the updating with observable collections. And then as we look through the code, of which there is really very little, we'll see that all of the manipulation is done to an observable object. The only thing that the view code does for us is decide what value to either add or remove. But the removal itself is done on an observable list. So here we have kitchen observable dry goods add, and the thing we're adding comes from information from the GUI. And here's the remove for that same data structure. And then for vegetable garden, there's the remove, and again the thing we're removing is determined by a control on the GUI along the same lines with add. So we never touch the properties of the GUI, we simply modify the observable list, and the WPF support code does the rest for us. Let's take a look at this application in action. And there you see our three visual data containers. We have a list view, a list box, and an items control. So the list view is the most sophisticated of the three. As you can see, it's got a header and columns for individual values to be displayed. The list box then is just an individual value, and items control is just a way to display a list of things, really. As you can see from the comment, there's no selection and there's no update to this. So by way of demonstration, let's go ahead and add an ingredient here. And you see then that is reflected in our list view, but again, the code behind for the GUI itself did not make that modification. The modification was made to the observable collection, and the GUI was automatically updated because of the assignment to item source. We can do the same thing with list box, and that's reflected there, and again the same rules apply. And again with items control, this is just intended to be a list of things, so all you really are doing is assigning something to item source, and then that is displayed. And that's what I mean about visual data containers, data binding, and observable collections. Thanks for staying with me.